Hello Misfitians and welcome back to this video. So as an update, a lot of you have been asking about Pepper, and the last time y'all saw her was when she was only 5 pounds and now she is about 30 pounds, so that's a huge update. Yes, aren't you? She just celebrated her 7th month birthday. So yeah, you got an itch. But today she's basically an only child because Teddy is at daycare, and Teddy goes to daycare usually once or twice a week just for socialization, and when Teddy is gone, she has the whole house to herself and she basically acts like an only child and a spoiled rotten little brat. So, don't you? Anyway, in today's video, the thing that I was going to do with all of y'all is basically walk you through how I set up a watercolor palette. Let's see how long this lasts with Pepper. Hey, hey. Thank you. You're not supposed to walk on the couch like that. Anyway, today's video is basically me walking you through the steps of why I chose the watercolor palette that I chose today, why I have that particular one that I like, as well as how I set up my watercolor palette with all of my paints, and introducing you to my kind of new watercolor palette. Before I had about 30 colors. I think in December of last year I had 30 some colors that I was working around with. Pepper, what you doing over there, honey? Before I had about 30 some colors. Now I've limited that down to about 20, and I'm going to be sharing with you my journey for that today. So let's go ahead and begin, shall we?
These are the days that fly by when you're not looking. Don't wanna waste it on all your nights spent alone again. We are different, stuck in a small town, haven't left just yet. Got bigger dreams running through our heads, oh.
So there are 3 criteria that I actually go by or look for when I am searching for a watercolor palette. And those 3 criteria are surface, as well as like texture, that kind of is included in surface, and then the wells, and then travelability. So those are the 3 things that I typically look for when purchasing a watercolor palette for myself. So the very first criteria is surface, and basically what I'm looking for is a very smooth surface that is also white. And the reason for that is because since we're painting with watercolor and we're diluting our colors with water, first off, you need that white surface to figure out how much water to paint you have mixed. So for me, there's typically 5 basic starting points for paint ratios, and I have a whole course completely dedicated to that. But that's the first thing that you're trying to kind of figure out, is how much water to paint you have mixed together in your palette. So you really need to have a nice, smooth, clean, white surface to figure that out. And then the next thing that you're trying to figure out after you kind of get an idea of that is your color hue. And you need a nice, clean, white surface in order to figure out, have I actually mixed the correct color hue that I'm wanting inside of my brain? So having a nice, smooth, white surface is really key important when purchasing a watercolor palette. Now, I'm sure that you have seen there is a huge amount of plastic watercolor palettes. For me personally, I do not like plastic watercolor palettes. I feel like the paint doesn't pool in them as easily as a metal palette or a porcelain palette, so I tend to lean more towards the metal or the porcelain. Now, porcelain, of course, is the best type of palette that you can purchase, but they tend to be very expensive and you don't have to spend that type of money on it. What I have done and what I have figured out is basically I purchased a metal palette, and I do some things to prep that metal palette for painting on, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But then the next thing that I do is I actually have a porcelain tasting dish that I got from World Market. You don't have to get it from World Market. You can, I'm sure you can pick up porcelain platters or plates from thrift stores or even dollar stores. There's a huge amount of them, but basically you want something that's either ceramic or porcelain because those are the nicest to really mix on. And what I've done is I basically have just put my tasting plate in my metal palette, and that is the best way for me to get the best of both worlds. So the metal palette it allows me to store my paints, but then the porcelain plate that I can just stick right on top whenever I'm painting allows me to mix my colors onto a porcelain surface. So that is the first thing that I'm looking for, is basically that surface and having nice smooth areas to mix pools of colors instead of little puddles or splotches. So that's kind of the first thing that I'm looking for. The next thing that I'm looking for when purchasing a watercolor palette is large wells. Now, I have purchased several different watercolor palettes with those smaller little plastic wells, and basically you can remove them and then put them back. For me personally, I tried painting with those and I really didn't like using those. I prefer more of the larger wells, and I actually really like the wells that are a little bit slanted, I've noticed, instead of the flat wells. I like the ones that are a little bit slanted because when I wet my colors, it kind of pulls that water down into the corner with my paint, and I have found that the paint actually stays wetter as I'm painting through the process of an illustration than having just a flat well. So that's a personal preference for me. I like my wells to kind of have a little bit of a slant to them as well as be larger. And then finally, the last thing that I really like is having a palette, a watercolor palette that can travel with me. So if I go to a place, I like to have a palette that I can take with me. It doesn't necessarily have to be super small. Some people like really, really small ones that they can just take with them. I don't really care about that. Usually when I'm going out painting somewhere, I'm not necessarily painting in a location where I have to have a super small palette. It's usually me going on vacation somewhere and I can go sit out on a deck or sit out, somewhere, but I'd like to have my watercolor palette with me. So personally, I like the larger size. I just like taking as many paints as I can with me. And I really like, this is kind of a travelability thing as well. I like palettes when you fold them. The paints, all the wells basically that hold your paints are on the bottom and not on the top. So some of the palettes that I've bought, and actually some of the ones that I bought from the same brand that I'm using today, they'll have the wells on both sides, and then when you fold them together, sometimes those paints on the top, they'll fall out. Basically, they don't adhere that well to the wells. So an easy way to correct that is just by getting wells on one side, and then whenever you close that palette, everything is on that one side and you always keep that one side down. And that other side is basically just used for mixing. So that's another thing that I personally really like when looking for a watercolor palette. So these are the steps of how I prep and go ahead and set up my watercolor palette. The very first thing that you're going to want to do, especially if you have purchased your watercolor palette from online, is you want to make sure you clean it thoroughly. You don't want any dust or any particles inside of especially those wells, because you don't want that getting into your paint and then drying in your paint, because you're going to see that later on when you're painting. So first off, make sure you just clean it. All I do typically is just run water over it, and then I just kind of wipe it down with a paper towel. And the reason why I do that is because the next step that I do is I actually take an old toothbrush, and then I take a just a tube of basic toothpaste. I think the brand that I use is Colgate with baking soda, and I really like that particular kind because it has kind of granules of baking soda in it, and you just take it and scrub your metal palette. And basically what this does is it creates a surface. It's not necessarily scraping per se the surface and damaging it, but basically what you're just trying to do is rough it up just a little bit, so that your paint will adhere better to it. So the way you can create pools of paint, especially in your palette when you're mixing, is just by roughing up that surface just a tiny bit. You don't want to create a lot of damage, but you just want to rough it up a tiny bit so it's not as sleek. Basically, since it's a metal palette, it's not as sleek. And what it will do is once it dries, it will have a little bit of an area for you to create pooling for your paints. So basically you'll make larger puddles, which are easier to gauge for how much paint you have mixed, even what colors you have mixed, and overall it's just an easier time to work with and paint with compared to not doing this step and working with those little puddles or little splotches and trying to gauge actually how much paint you have mixed in your palette. So that's the first thing that I do, and then after I'm done with that, I'll let that completely dry before I start adding my paints. So while my palette is basically drying from the toothpaste mixture hack, I will take the paints that I'm planning on putting in my palette and line them up typically on the table next to my palette in the order of basically the color wheel, or if you're kind of confused how the color wheel would look, just think of a rainbow basically. So I will order typically my paints from red or pink all the way to purple or violet, whatever you're including in your set. And then after I get done with that, ordering them basically in the rainbow, I will then order my neutrals, and I typically do from lightest to darkest. So I'll usually start with yellow ochre, and then I will slowly move on to burnt umber or Payne's gray or a neutral like neutral tint. I'll end with the darker neutrals next. Now, if you're a little bit confused of what colors should go where, especially I've noticed a lot of people are like, I have two yellows that are really, really close to one another, so which one goes first and which one goes second when I'm trying to order them based on the color wheel? Well, the best way to actually figure that out is to paint with that paint on a swatch of scrap paper and then allow it to completely dry. And after that color has completely dried, go ahead and take those little swatches and then order them based on how it would look according to the color wheel, but really according to a rainbow. So I find it's easier after your paints have dried to kind of figure out the order if you're a little bit confused. However, I've been painting with my colors for so long, I know what they look like and I know where to put them based on the color wheel. So I didn't do that step, but if you're a little bit confused of where they're actually supposed to go, that's a really quick way to kind of hack that and figure it out. It's a lot easier, in my opinion, to sort out that particular way than just looking at the tube and trying to figure it out. All right, now that you have figured out kind of the order that you want to put your paints in, the next thing that I do is I like to just go one by one with my paints and go ahead and add paint to each of my wells. And where I like to add the paint for my wells is really close to that corner of the well, and I basically fill that little area. I don't fill the entire well up, but I fill just the corner. And basically that's it. You just go one by one through your paint colors and continue to fill all of those wells up. And once you have all of those wells completely filled, the next thing that I recommend doing is just setting your palette aside you probably want to try and close it if you have all your paints on one side like mine. Go ahead and close it so that you don't get any dust or any hair into your paints while they're still wet, and allow them to dry, I would say, for 24 to 72 hours. Now, why is there such a huge gap of time when I'm telling you, like, why is it 24 to 72? Well, the reason is because of humidity in your air. Some of your paints might take longer to dry if you're in a high humidity area. So I live in the South, and especially in the summer, it is high humidity. Pretty much every day we have tons of humidity, and that's the reason why my hair is always frizzed out. On those particular days, my paints are going to, typically when I'm setting up a palette, they're going to, I think this time they took about 52 hours about to dry. But if I do the same thing in the winter, since there's less humidity in the air, they usually take about 24 hours. So it's really based on how much humidity is in the air and how long it's going to take for those paints to dry. Now, how do you know if your paints are dry? One way you can check to see if they're dry is if you take a brush and then you kind of just, you're not really pushing into the paint, but you're just kind of pushing on top. So it's like, this is the dried paint, and you just push on top. If it's hard, completely hard, and it doesn't budge, it's dry. But if you start to see kind of like a little bit of this action going on, or a little bit of springing happening with your brush, that means the outside is dry or cased, but then the inside is still wet. So you want to leave that until it's completely dry before you actually start painting with your palette. And that is basically a sum up of how I choose my palette, as well as how I set up my watercolor palette. If y'all are curious about other things with my watercolor palette, go ahead and leave a comment down below and I'll try and answer those for you on this particular video. And also make sure to follow me on Instagram and follow me on Facebook. That's where a lot of these kind of questions about my watercolor palette came from, because I posted an image about me setting up a new palette and y'all had a lot of questions about it. So that's kind of where this video came from. And if you want to follow me over there and just leave questions or have a conversation with me over there, go ahead and do that, as well as leave comments down below. So that is it for this particular video, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you next time. Bye, y'all.
These are the days that fly by when you're not looking. Don't wanna waste it on all your nights spent alone again. We are different, stuck in a small town, haven't left just yet. Got bigger dreams running through our heads.